I am General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, and welcome here to the library, where today I will talk about the second part of a four-part series, The Road to War, resulting in the firing on Fort Sumter on April 12th of 1861. In 1849, because of the California Gold Rush and the flooding of people to the west, California wanted to enter the Union as a state, as a free state. This caused quite a flurry of activity, both north and south, because there was no corresponding slave state to come into the Union, and California would upset the balance in the Senate and in the House about the voting, and as the Southerners perceived, it would tip the balance fatally against them in Congress. There was much discussion and talk about what to do, talk of a compromise, how to address the issues of whether the land gained from the Mexican War and the Louisiana Purchase would be slave or free. Texas wanted to extend its boundaries far beyond what it ultimately became. A tougher fugitive slave law, California being a free state, maybe broken into two states, slavery in the District of Columbia, indeed. So there were a number of questions. And as Congress opened in January of 1850, President Taylor is opposed to any compromise. Let California come in as a free state, and that's that. Rumblings in Texas about we're going to get more territory than what is being talked about us getting, and so forth. So John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster, and Stephen Douglas are responsible for crafting the omnibus bill that was introduced on January the 29th to address all of these issues. They formed the committee of 13 senators that drew up the bill. And Calhoun introduced it, Clay talked of it. Calhoun was dying. Indeed, he died in March. When he made a second speech, he couldn't make it. It had to be read by someone else, and another senator, and it lasted an hour and a half. Clay was able to stand a couple of times to receive applause. Daniel Webster made a 3-hour speech in 3 parts addressing the North, the South, and Western expansion. Clay made his talks, and there was great furor and great consternation. The bill, after 7 months of discussion, was defeated. Even though it had many appealing factors to it for both North and South, they both voted against it because the negative aspects to it they felt greater than what would accrue to them as benefits. So it was defeated. But Stephen Douglas pulled it out of the fire, so to speak, and broke it into 5 different bills. All 5 bills passed. Now they were defeated in an omnibus bill, but broken into 5 parts. Each one passed with significantly different majorities because people could vote against it or for it as their constituents back home saw fit. And this was a vote along sectional lines, not party lines, and the battle cry became sectional honor. So the 5 bills resolved the issues like this. Slavery, which had been banned by the United States in 1808 and was healthy and well in Washington, D.C., was permitted to stay in D.C., that you could own slaves, but the trade of slaves was prohibited. So you couldn't buy or sell them, but you could own them in the District of Columbia. And oddly enough, the largest slave market in North America was in Washington, D.C. And in fact, when that part of the bill was passed, Alexandria, Virginia, which had the slave market, opted to pull out of the District of Columbia and asked Virginia to take it back, and they did. So what was a square layout of the city of Washington, District of Columbia, is now a backward L, and that missing section was the largest slave market in North America, Alexandria, Virginia, which left the District of Columbia. So you could own a slave in Washington City, but you couldn't buy or sell one. Another part of the compromise was California was admitted as a slave state, as a free state. But one of its senators was obligated to vote with the South. Now, that assured balance in the Senate of the vote. Talk of breaking it into two states was quickly squelched, because that would only mean more representatives and more senators of a free state in the Senate and in the House. So that talk went nowhere. California came in as a free state. One of their senators was obligated to vote with the South. Utah and New Mexico were established as territories. Now that's from the land acquired from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. They were allowed to establish territorial governments, obviously to petition for statehood. But in that compromise, no word was said about them being free or slave. They would be allowed to determine that by vote when they came into the United States as a state, each of them. So the idea of popular sovereignty actually goes back to New Mexico and Utah, admitted as territories in 1850, but were able to, at some point in the future, to decide whether they would be slave or free. An interesting feature of these 5 bills was the Texas issue and its border. Texas claimed land from the Mexican War that was far greater than what it currently has in its present state boundaries. In fact, it claimed land all the way up to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they were a slave state, and they wanted to extend the slavery in the territory up that far. Now, the people in New Mexico disagreed with this, but Texas even sent an armed party, many armed men, into New Mexico to go to Santa Fe and take New Mexico. Of course, New Mexico organized a militia. President Taylor is saying he'll get in the field and lead troops himself if necessary. But fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and no one fired on anyone in New Mexico, and the current boundary of the state of Texas was established, and Texas accepted it along with $10 million in cash that was given them, which they used to pay their reparations, war debts agreements with the country of Mexico. So Texas was resolved with the money issue and with the current borders that it's got. There was also the Nashville Convention that was held to discuss secession. Not many states attended it, but there was a conference held in Nashville, Tennessee to discuss secession. And the Fugitive Slave Act, to appease the Southerners, was passed, which toughened the fugitive slave law currently in existence. it added, or should I say detracted, the right to trial by jury. A captured slave had no trial by jury. It authorized federal marshals to pursue runaway slaves, and it made it a crime to feed or house or in any way assist a runaway slave, with punishments of fines up to $1,000 and 6 months in prison. And commissioners were established to hear the claims of slave catchers. And this was a situation where if the commissioner ruled that the black person or persons at hand were indeed not runaway slaves, and many free slaves, persons of color, were caught up in this net and sold south. But if the commissioner ruled that they were not a runaway slave, or the person that the slave catchers said, he got $5. If he ruled that they were a runaway slave, he got $10. Obviously, this was decried as being very pro-South, pro-slavery, and stacked in favor of the South. And this law made everybody responsible for the capture of slaves. And the federal marshals were brought in, special commissioners brought in, that were created to hear cases, no trial by jury, blacks couldn't testify in their own behalf, and if you aided or abetted any runaway slave or black person, then you could be fined $1,000 and indeed jailed up to 6 months. This made runaway slaves the problem of everybody in the North. If you had knowledge of a runaway slave, then you were guilty of violating the Fugitive Slave Act. And that was an incendiary piece of legislation. So all of these bills came together. California came in as a slave state. Slavery was outlawed. Trading was outlawed in Washington, D.C., but you could still own a slave. Utah and Mexico, New Mexico, came in as territories to determine whether or not they wanted to be free or slave upon petition to become states. Texas got its current boundary far less than what it claimed it was due, but they got $10 million in cash from the government to settle it. And we had a much, much tougher Fugitive Slave Act, which was most inflammatory throughout the North. And the men responsible for the omnibus bill, Clay, Calhoun, Webster, and Douglas, but Senator Douglas was most responsible for getting the 5 separate bills passed. So the same legislation was defeated in the compromise bill, omnibus bill, but passed separately, the ways of Congress. Now that was the political aspect of this discussion in the road to war. The social aspect was in the publication of a 2-volume work in March of 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. Now, it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, or Hattie Stowe, as her family and husband knew her. Hattie was the daughter of the famous Beecher family of New England, the preachers and evangelists. They changed how preaching is done in America. They were indeed powerful in the pulpit and in our social fabric. In 1832, she moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, with her father, who had gone to help found the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. She met and later married Lyman Stowe, and she had 6 children while she was there. And in 1849, it was a tragedy that she lost their 18-month-old son, Charlie. A cholera epidemic had swept through Cincinnati and carried off their 18-month-old son. And it was then that Harriet Beecher Stowe, said at the grave of her son, she realized how tragic and painful it must be for a slave mother to have a child torn away from her and sold south, sold into slavery, as she was at the grave of her own son that she had lost. And that she was also a writer. She couldn't preach, limitations of her sex at that time. She couldn't preach, but she could write. In fact, she was selling stories from time to time to tracts and travel logs to help the financial burden of the family, because the Lane Theological Seminary was struggling and could not even afford to pay her husband his full salary. And they had child after child. So it was a struggle, but she's already writing. She had gone over into Kentucky, just across the river, to visit, and had seen slavery firsthand, and had a close look at it. Indeed, hired former slaves, or one turned out later a runaway slave in her home. So she was incensed and deeply touched about slavery. And coming from the family she was a member of, she had a long background in reform activities. They, after the death of their son in 1850, they moved to Bowdoin College, and where her husband began teaching. And her sister-in-law wrote her a letter and said, "If I could do what you can do with a pen, I would write something to fight this evil." She took that to heart. She was writing articles to make a few dollars to help pay the family budget. But she had seen a book, the Americans, are titled "American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses." And it was a compendium of eyewitnesses of cruelties and tragedies and travesties in slavery in the South. And she credits going to communion one February Sunday in 1851, and she had a vision during the communion, had a vision. And in that vision, she saw four main characters. The character of Tom being beaten by two other slaves under the direction of a cruel overseer, Simon Legree. And she hurried home after the service and began writing furiously. And indeed, she said that she didn't write the book, that God gave her the book, and she merely wrote what God told her and what came to her in visions. And she told her husband that she intended to sell this to the National Era, Washington city anti-slavery newspaper, monthly newspaper. And she contacted them. They were enthusiastic, and she had initially planned to have 3 or 4 installments. Well, they kept coming, and she developed the book as she was writing it. It had a northern with George and Eliza plot side to it, and she had a southern side to the plot with Uncle Tom and Little Eva and her father, St. Clair. And so she was touching the issue of slavery both north and south. And she wrote and wrote until she finally wrote the last installment, and she said that she felt completely drained of everything and physically exhausted. Well, she might be. There were 41 installments of Life Among the Lowly, or Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then in March of 1852, the book was published a month after the last serial installment. It came out in 2 volumes. and it was an immediate hit. In the first few weeks of sales, it sold 10,000 copies in 2 days. Sold 305,000 volumes, or 2-volume sets. In fact, it sold at 1.5 million in Britain, and it was a runaway bestseller. In fact, it remained a bestseller for many years. So she, overnight, so to speak, was launched into, she and her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, into the national spotlight. And of course, it was an explosion. In the North, with indignation about slavery, and in the South, with rage about slavery. She was perplexed about this because as the flames rose higher, she was careful not to vilify anyone in the South. The Southern people were not vilified. She attacked and criticized and vilified slavery, the institution. She didn't vilify anybody in the North, slave catchers and hunters and traders in specific. She vilified the system. And yet she was burned in effigy. Her books were burned. Mail sacks full of books her books were burned. And the South called it debasing, puerile trash, that it was nothing but a propaganda to put down slavery. The people in the North, the South was outraged. The people in the North were indignant, equally as emotional, different reason, different direction, because people felt like they were seeing slavery for what it was for the first time. It personalized the story or the institution of slavery through a story. It brought it home and into the parlors and living rooms of everybody in the North. In the South too, if you could get a copy before it was destroyed. And it put a face, it put a heart to slavery, a cruel heart and a hard hand. And it just kept selling and caused an ongoing controversy. Now, in 1853, because of the cries and the objections that she just fictionalized everything, she wrote another book, nonfiction book, called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she listed her sources. In fact, she listed many more new sources that would point the reader to the truth about slavery and the numbers and statistics and eyewitness accounts. The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1853. As a result, and then they moved to Massachusetts in the summer of '52, she and her family. But as a result of Uncle Tom's Cabin, for her personally, I think of interest, she met both Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison of the Liberator. Arguably the leading voice, white voice, against slavery and the leading black voice against slavery. She had invited William Lloyd Garrison. Frederick Douglass came visiting unannounced, and she was very taken with both of them. In fact, she was excited after talking to Douglass and said that she wanted to build a black vocational school to train black people to useful arts to make a living. And Douglass was most enthusiastic about that. He said, we don't need the classics. We need to be able to work and ply a trade and make a living. That's what's important here in the moment. That didn't happen. She was going to pay for that through the sales of her books in England, 1.5 million sales, but they were pirated copies. So she only made, out of 1.5 million sales of her 2-volume book, she only made $500. She went to England on a promotional tour, and that's where she got her 500 and found out her books had been pirated copies. so she wasn't able to finance the institution. Moreover, it wouldn't have been done anyway because of opposition of both Northern and Southern abolitionists who said we can't countenance a single race school. So her planned vocational school for black people came to naught. She was also surprised to find out that Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison of the Liberator, and Frederick Douglass could not abide each other. The two leaders in the abolition movement could not stand each other, and she, in fact, tried to bring them to a meeting and reconcile their differences, and both firmly declined to do so, which is an irony in the fight against slavery by arguably the two leaders of the fight against slavery. But she made $60,000 in the first year and a half after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in March of 1852. $60,000. And she said, moreover, of the 30 books that she wrote, although she's known for Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Hattie Stowe, wrote 30 books. She said it was a blessing because of the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Every book that she wrote after that sold at least 100,000 copies, seldom less. So she was able to put the family on a very sound, in fact, prosperous financial basis. So those are some more of the steps in the road to war. The coming in of California as a free state, the Compromise of 1850 Omnibus Bill by Clay, Calhoun, Webster, and Douglass, which was defeated. Douglass breaking it into 5 parts, each part passing successfully, doing away with slave trading in Washington City, but you could still own slaves. The largest slave market in North America opting to leave Washington City, District of Columbia, go back into the state of Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia. Utah and New Mexico coming in as territories to decide for themselves if they would be territories. The Fugitive Slave Act toughened Texas, getting its present boundary not near what it wanted, but getting $10 million. Uncle Tom's Cabin being published in 1852, and igniting the flames that it did, and some of the background about Hattie Stowe, who wrote it, and results of the book, what she was able to do with the rest of her life because of Uncle Tom's Cabin. One other thing I should like to talk about briefly is the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Now, I say briefly because one could talk a long time on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but I would like to say this much. Stephen Douglas was the driving force behind it, and he was a firm believer in the voice of the people and in popular sovereignty. Let the people speak. It's the ultimate act of a democracy. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act flew in the face of the Compromise of 1820, which had staved off war for some 3 decades. It disrupted everything that had been gone before it. It outraged a new unknown politician out of Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. It was a primary force in the formation of the Republican Party. It also began savagery and bloodshed in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska for people coming in to support slavery or oppose slavery, and many people died a violent death, and much property was destroyed in that fight to bring the states in, both as a slave state or as a free state. It was also the death knell, ultimately, of Stephen Douglas's aspirations to become president. He was vilified by the Southern Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was splitting up. Whigs were disintegrating. The Republican Party is birthed and growing strongly. Abraham Lincoln's career is launched. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are held in 7 different locations in the state of Illinois. Lincoln trying to be elected to the Senate. Lincoln knew he wasn't going to be elected to the Senate, but as he said at the time to a friend, when he was asked, why did you take on Judge Douglas? You know you can't win, because the state houses elected the senators. And Lincoln said, I know I can't beat Judge Douglas, but I have bigger fish to fry. And he pinned Douglas down time and again during those debates about popular sovereignty, and stressed how the country was being, particularly Kansas-Nebraska, by the struggle to be either slave or free, with people pouring in, going across the border, killing, destroying, and either staying or going back into Missouri and other surrounding areas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, with popular sovereignty, established another battle cry to go along with sectional honor. As I said earlier, voting is not along party lines, it's along sectional lines. So sectional honor and popular sovereignty, 2 battle cries in the early and mid-1850s. I've said quite enough for this part of the road to war. In our next meeting, part 3, I'm going to discuss and devote the time to the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision in 1857, a landmark case for the Supreme Court, often said to be the worst decision ever issued by the Supreme Court, even though it was a 7-2 ruling. Dred Scott, his travails, travels, and triumphs ultimately, and what our Supreme Court had to say about whether people were property or not. So until the next time that we come together here in the library for part 3 of The Road to War, I bid you warmly adieu.